This morning, what I would like to do is to introduce the meditation method. The practice that we are doing comes from Mahāsī Sayadaw, so it's often known as the Mahāsī method. Mahāsī was part of a much broader movement that began in the late or middle 19th century, that became very strong in the early 20th century, a movement in Burma to spread meditation to as many people as possible, and that meant to lay people, and serious meditation that aims at awakening. Today, for example, certainly in Australia, meditation as therapy is very popular. Meditation as relaxation is very popular. All of that is fine, it's good, but it's not meditation for awakening, for enlightenment. In the modern insight movement, especially strong in Burma, the idea is to do meditation for the transformation of the way that one lives, for awakening itself. So this is part of a broader movement focused on the revival of serious meditation practice within Buddhism. The method is based on a tradition taught by the Buddha called Satipatthana, often translated the establishments of mindfulness or the foundations of mindfulness. And during this retreat, we're going to talk a lot about sati and satipatthana, mindfulness and the practice of mindfulness, because this is at the very centre of the whole thing. But you also, today, you find the idea of insight meditation and serenity meditation. So Mahāsī Sayadaw's approach to meditation is classified as part of insight meditation. But when we look at Satipatthana, and when we look at what we actually do when we're meditating, there's a lot more than just insight. And so what I am teaching here is not so much the Mahāsī method as a Mahāsī method. Since Mahāsī died, and since this method, this approach to meditation has spread so far and become so popular, also it's changed. And of course, if you're a Buddhist, this is perfectly natural because you know everything changes depending upon conditions. So of course, the meditation method adapts and it changes. So now there's a whole range of different approaches to meditation which come from Mahāsī Sayadaw, out of that lineage. And what I am doing is part of that. So these days, I don't say that I teach the Mahāsī method, I say that I teach a Mahāsī method. And there's a difference, and you'll probably find this out as we go through the retreat. Before we even come to that, we could ask the fundamental question: when we say meditation, what do we mean? What is meditation? And I would say that meditation, in the Buddha's sense, is the systematic training of attention. So if we ask, what is attention? We can say that attention is the deliberate placing of awareness on its object. And if we ask, well, what do we mean by awareness? We can say awareness is the knowing of the object. So what I want to do is to work backwards and find out what's going on. So we begin with awareness. And the whole question of what do we mean by awareness? What is it exactly? So here I've defined it as awareness is the knowing of the object. If I am aware of something. For example, if I am seeing something. If I am hearing something. If I am thinking something. So there's the awareness, the seeing, and there's the object, what it is that I see. And they always go together. If you have one, you have the other. So awareness is the knowing of the object. And this knowing is an elemental knowing. It's not intellectual, it's not an understanding so much as it's the presence of something. Something is present to me. So let's take seeing. Right now, you can see. You are seeing something. What that means is that something is present to you. So right now, I can see you in the hall. You are present to me. But right now, you are absent. You just disappeared. You are completely absent. And then suddenly, you are present. So did you feel yourself disappear? No, probably not. You stayed the same, but my experience of you changed. You were present, and then you were absent, and then you're present again. So awareness is presence. It's a quality, the presence of that which is present. Or here I'm saying the knowing of an object. So something is present to me or not. Where you are sitting, for example, the Buddha image is present to you. Where I am sitting, it is absent. Whereas the clock at the back of the hall is present to me. But it's absent to you, except to Katerina, who turned around to make sure that there was one. So something is present or it is absent. But there's more to it than that. Presence itself, awareness itself, can have different degrees. Something can be very clearly present to me, or can be very faintly present to me, or somewhere in between. So right now, you are present to me. But the people at the back are less present than the people at the front. The people at the front are quite clear, but the people at the back are very hazy, very blurry. If I put these on, suddenly the people at the back are quite clear. And I take them off and you've become blurry again. So something can be very clearly present to me. I can see it very clearly, very sharply, or it can be not so clear. It's still present, but it's not so present. Is this making sense? So, awareness has depth. I can be slightly aware or deeply aware, or something in between. And if awareness has depth, that means I can do something to become more aware. And what I do is I pay attention. Attention is the deliberate placing of awareness on its object. Now, you notice that awareness happens without us having to do anything about it. I wake up in the morning and I can see. I'm not trying to see, I just see. Sometimes the environment is very ugly and I wish I did not see it. Sometimes it might be something like I wake up in the morning, I go to the bathroom and I look in the mirror and I wish I could see something else. But there it is. Awareness happens whether I want it to or not. But attention is different. Attention is something that is voluntary. I have to do attention. Attention is the deliberate placing of awareness on its object. So attention is deliberately doing awareness, as distinct from just being aware. It's the difference between seeing and looking. I already see. There's no effort involved. But let's say I was expecting one particular person to come to this retreat, and I want to know, did she come? Is she here? And I start to look. I'm still seeing, but the quality of seeing is different, isn't it? There's more energy and there's more aim involved. So when we talk about attention, we're still talking about awareness, but it has a different flavour to it. Here it's deliberate, it's more energetic, and there's some kind of method involved. So if I'm looking for someone, did so-and-so turn up? I start to search the room. I can introduce method. How will I do it? Well, I could start from my left and work my way across to the right, or I could start from the right, work my way across to the left, or I could start at the back, work my way forward, or I could start at the front, work my way back, or I could be completely random and go anywhere. So as soon as we talk about attention, we're introducing doing something deliberately, and that brings in the whole question of method. How do I do it? And that brings us to meditation. Meditation is the systematic training of attention. I want to develop attention so that awareness will grow stronger. How do I develop attention? I train myself in some way. And as soon as I make that choice, then what method of training do I do? There are different methods. These different methods represent the different meditation techniques that you can use. So if you take up meditation practice, there's a whole range of meditation techniques and methods that are available. Different religions, different traditions within the same religion. There's secular approaches to meditation. There's a whole variety of approaches to meditation. And each of them is a method to train attention in order to develop awareness. Mahāsī Sayadaw, it was actually Mahāsī's teacher, Mingun Sayadaw, developed a particular way of cultivating attention. And the way he did it is this. First of all, as we said, if I am aware, I'm aware of something. That something is my object of awareness. So when we start doing meditation practice, usually the first thing that happens is that we are given a meditation object. We're given something to be aware of. Probably, at least in Buddhism, probably the most common meditation object is breathing. So you might be told, what I want you to do is sit down, focus on your breathing, and then follow your breathing from now until the end of the meditation period. Would that be a familiar kind of meditation instruction? No, that's quite straightforward. So you're given a meditation object. And we call this the primary object. Mahāsī calls it the primary object. He actually called it the Mula Aramana in Pali language. Mula means root or foundation. So the foundational object, the root object. In English it gets translated as the primary object. Now this primary object is very important because this is what we work with. It is our central reference point. It's where we begin, it's where we end. Whenever we're not quite sure what to do, we come back to the primary object. If there's any doubt, we go to the primary object. and we study the primary object closely over a period of time, and we really get to know it. And in that process, attention gets stronger and awareness gets stronger. In Mahāsī's approach, in the sitting, the primary object is the breathing sensed in the abdomen, in the lower part of the torso. And he calls it the rising and falling of the abdomen. If you sit and you start to focus in on breathing, firstly, how do you know you are breathing? What tells you you are breathing? When I ask this question, people sometimes say, well, of course I'm breathing, I'm alive. True, but that's inference. That's a thought. But what's the direct experience of breathing? How do I know that this is breathing? Well, basically it's movement. Movement inside the body. If I'm sitting, the body is still. In that stillness, I look for movement. And if I find it, that's the breathing. It has that quality of movement. So Mahāsī would say, look for that movement, but especially look for it in the lower part of the body, around the abdomen. Some people feel it a bit higher in the diaphragm. Some people feel it very low. But follow those movements. And he calls this the rising and falling of the abdomen. When we breathe in, he says, it's like the abdomen rises. When we breathe out, it falls. So rising, falling. Don't get too caught up on the words. Some people say, I can't do the rising and falling of the abdomen. And I ask, but why? And they say, well, when I breathe, it doesn't rise, it goes around. And I say, that's okay. You just call that rising. So rising and falling are just code for whatever movements you experience in this area as you breathe in and breathe out. So this is the primary object. If you've ever attempted this, it seems very simple and straightforward, and if you've ever attempted it, you discover that it's impossibly difficult. Because what happens very quickly is that the mind leaves the rising and the falling of the abdomen and it goes somewhere else. The mind is distracted. Has anybody here ever experienced distraction? Yeah? Very good. What we're going to do in this retreat is study distraction a lot, because it's very important, particularly for developing insight. The mind is distracted. Suddenly awareness goes from here, my primary object, and it goes somewhere else. And you notice that what happens is you're calmly doing meditation, and then suddenly you realise, oh, I'm not meditating at all. Actually, my mind has gone somewhere else. Let's say thinking, or the other most common distraction would be pain. My leg has started to hurt, and my awareness goes to the pain. Now, usually, what do we do when we discover that we're distracted? Usually we first respond with some kind of shock and horror. Oh dear, this should not be happening. We might punish ourselves, we might scold ourselves. You're such a hopeless meditator. How can you be doing this? And then we decide, well, I've taken a nice little break from my meditation and I've got to get back to my primary object. And so we go back to the primary object and we start again. And this pattern happens again and again and again. And what we find is that we are at war with ourselves. We want to stay with the primary object, but we don't. So fighting, fighting, fighting. If you meditate for 1 hour, let's say, on the breathing, that's 60 minutes. What would you guess? How many minutes would you actually spend on the breathing? You don't have to answer this question because it might be embarrassing. For some people might say, well, if I'm really completely honest about it, in 60 minutes I might maybe spend 5 minutes on the breathing. If you do 30, you're doing really well. Really well. A lot of the time, even most of the time, we are not on our primary object. So if I think that meditation is staying with my primary object, then I have to consider myself a failure. Actually, failure is another theme that we should have to discuss during this retreat. Recently I read a profound truth, which is something that I kind of intuitively knew, but for decades never actually brought up into my conscious mind. One of the fundamental qualifications for a successful meditator, and I want you to look at yourselves as I say this, one of the fundamental qualifications of a successful meditator is the willingness and the ability to live with failure. Failure is absolutely central to a meditation practice. Most of the time, it's not good enough. And that's normal. And we as meditators have to be willing to live with this if we are to make progress and be successful as meditators. The willingness to live with failure is really important. Often this sense of failure will come from this relationship to the primary object. I can't stay on it long enough. What Mahāsī Sayadaw tried to do was to cut through this whole thing and to abolish distraction. And what he said was, if you realise you're distracted, at the moment you realise you are distracted, you are aware of something. As soon as you know that you're distracted, that something you are aware of is already your meditation object. And he calls this the secondary object. As soon as I know that I'm thinking, the experience of thinking becomes my meditation object. As soon as I know that I am obsessing about the pain and the obsession is already my meditation object. And he calls this the secondary object. And he says, be deliberately aware of this. With physical pain, for example, you suddenly realise it hurts, then send the awareness deliberately to that pain, right into the centre of it. What is it? How do I know that it's painful? What are the sensations? Is it hard? Is it soft? Is it sharp? Is it dull? Is it steady? Is it throbbing? Is it pulsing? What is it? What is it exactly? And what is it doing? Is it hot? Is it cold? Is it moving? Is it still? So I start to look carefully at this experience, and I also start to look at the mind that does not want that sensation. So there's two aspects of pain. We'll talk more about this as we go through. If it's thinking, I realise that I'm thinking, then I start to study the whole process, the whole experience of thinking. What is the experience of being caught up in thought? Have you noticed that sometimes we realise that we're thinking and immediately the thought stops? Does that ever happen? If that happens, the thought is already gone, but what does it feel like to have been caught up in thought? It's like the aftertaste of thought. Oh, I was thinking all this time. What does that feel like to have that feeling? Oh, I've been thinking all this time. That becomes the meditation object. If the thought is still going because it's so strong, then the meditation object becomes the experience of thinking. What does it feel like to be caught up in this thought? That experience is now the meditation object. It's the secondary object. So we are deliberately aware of that, and then we come back to the primary object. So what we have is a particular relationship to our experience. We classify our experience into primary object, secondary object. The primary object is what we choose. I am going to stay with, let's say, rising and falling of the abdomen when I sit. And that becomes my central reference point. But I don't stay there all the time. I don't even expect to stay there all the time. I go there to the central point and then I'm taken somewhere else. And that somewhere else becomes my meditation object. I come back to the primary object. I'm taken somewhere else. That becomes my object. I come back to the primary object. I'm taken somewhere else. That becomes my meditation object. I go back, boom, back, forth, back and forth, back and forth. So the primary object is the central reference point. It's the place that I start with. It's the place that I keep coming back to, again and again and again. Everything else is my secondary object. Whatever experience I have, that becomes my meditation object. Making sense? Any questions so far? Yeah.
Is this thing about thought and awareness, are they quite different? Because you have to think about it's hard, it's soft, and so on. That's thought. But awareness is like a feeling. So I get very confused between the knowing part and the thinking part. When does it stop? Because we're supposed to stop all that thinking.
So the question, if I understand it correctly, is basically the distinction between, I would say, feeling and knowing. So if I suddenly realise that I'm thinking, but if I start asking myself, well, what's this like? What's the experience? I'm adding more thinking to it. If I have pain and I start to say, well, is it hard? What is it? Is it hard? Is it soft? Etc. That's just thinking. But it's not directly feeling the pain. It's not directly feeling the mind. When we start doing this practice, usually there's a bit of extra, we have to think about the process. It's like if you start to drive a car. When you start, you're both driving the car and thinking about driving the car. But once you get used to it, the thinking about just drops away and you just drive. And so the meditation method is like that. When you start, it can feel quite artificial. It can even increase thinking rather than decrease thinking, because you're thinking about the meditation method. But as you get used to it, that falls away and it just becomes more natural. Sometimes you might find you're thinking too much about the method.
Is it why yesterday, the first day I came, I was a little bit tired, so maybe I was doing the thinking. Today maybe it's not so bad as well.
So yesterday you're doing more thinking than today? Tiredness has a lot to do with it. You can't meditate effectively when you're tired. So it can take several days before you fully wake up. Conditions change. You'll find as you stay here over the retreat, it'll get better and better. But certainly tiredness gets in the way. It's a major barrier. When Mahāsī talks about this process, there are three crucial terms that we use: noting, naming, and noticing. Mahāsī would say, you note the meditation object. And by that he means to be deliberately aware of something. I forget what the Burmese verb is that gets translated into English as to note. But essentially it just means to be aware of. When you're asked to note the meditation object, what you're being asked is to be deliberately aware of it. So look at this, not that, this. This is noting, deliberate awareness. Then there's naming. Mahāsī says that it can help the noting, help the deliberate awareness by naming what you are aware of. So, for example, if I'm seeing, I can name paper, microphone, recorder, floor, torch, person, clock, fan. So what I'm doing is I'm aiming my awareness. I'm looking at the fan, I'm not looking at the clock. Fan. Okay, now I'm looking at the clock, I'm not looking at the fan. So when you name something, you are aiming awareness. This is what I'm aware of. I'm not aware of other things, I'm aware of this. So the naming helps precision. Mahāsī would recommend when you're in the sitting meditation, when you're doing the breathing, sensed in the abdomen, you can name it rising, falling, rising, falling. So as you breathe in, you can name it rising. As you breathe out, you name it falling. And the name helps aim, direct the awareness. Suddenly you realise that you're thinking, and you can name it thinking, thinking, and then come back. Suddenly you realise it's pain, you can name it pain, or you can name it hard, or sharp, or dull, whatever it is, and then come back. So the naming helps the accuracy of the awareness. So there's noting, there's naming, and the last one is noticing. Now this third one has a lot to do with the nature of attention. If we ask, well, what is attention? Well, what we're presented with, let's say seeing, we're presented with a whole field of visual data coming in, the whole package. If I pay attention to something, I look at that person, for example, and suddenly that person becomes the centre of my visual field. So let's say if I'm looking at the back, I look at the clock. So the clock is at the centre of my visual field, but around it I can see other things. I can see the back wall, I can see the door, I can see windows, I can see the people, I can see the floor, I can see the microphone very close to me. But at the centre is the clock. There's centre and there's the periphery around the centre. If I then switch, okay, I'll look at the fan. Boom. Now the fan is at the centre, but around it I can see other things. I can still see the wall, the back wall, the sides, the people, floor. I can see the clock in the background, but I'm focused on the fan. And then if I switch back to the clock, boom, that's at the centre. Awareness always has this quality. There's something at the centre of my field of awareness, and around it there are other things happening. What we work with in meditation mostly is that centre. And so when we say to note something, to be deliberately aware of something, we make that the centre of our field of awareness. But that doesn't mean that everything else stops. Other things are still happening. So for example, I can be sitting here in the hall, following my breathing as my meditation object, and I can hear the sounds from outside. Construction. Someone driving a car. Conversations from down below. Hammering. The creek. The fans. There's all this sound coming in. Now the fact that I can hear these sounds is not distraction. This is noticing. I am noting my breathing, and at the same time noticing, oh yes, there's sounds in the background. Similarly with thinking. I can be noting my breathing, but at the same time there's thought going on in the background. But it's not bothering me. But I notice it. Now that noticing, as we continue to practice, will become stronger. We become more sensitive as the meditation develops. This is one of the reasons why silence is so important. The way that we move, speak, and so on is important because we are becoming much more sensitive, others are becoming much more sensitive. And the sensitivity works in the sense that we start to notice more and more and more of what's going on around us. We don't shut down, we open up. But we just notice it, we just let it be there while we work with that point of attention at the centre. So let's say that I'm following the breathing, and let's say that I notice that I am thinking. That is not distraction. Let's say that I'm following the breathing, I notice that I'm thinking at the same time, And then suddenly I realise I've completely forgotten the breathing and I'm completely caught up in the thought. What's happened there is the point of attention has shifted from the breathing, boom, to the thought. So before, the breathing was at the centre, the foreground, and in the background was the thinking, but then suddenly, it's the opposite. The thinking is now in the foreground and the breathing is in the background, or maybe forgotten. That is distraction. Sometimes people get confused with this idea of primary and secondary object. So they start to meditate and then they notice that there's a sound. Oh, I'm supposed to note the sound. And then they notice that there's a sensation in the body. Oh, I'm supposed to note that. And then they notice that something else is happening. Oh, I should note that. And the awareness is going everywhere. And they get completely spun out, dizzy, and they think, I can't do this. Because they're not realising the difference between noting and noticing. So allow yourself to notice what is going on, but be clear about where that centre of attention is. Is it on the breathing, or is it on the thinking, or is it on the pain, or is it somewhere else? So in the walking, we've been talking about the primary object being the rising and falling of the abdomen. In the sitting, and we're talking about that. In the walking, we have a different meditation object. And what I'll do now is I go through the walking meditation. Now, the first thing to note about the walking is that fundamentally it's very, very simple. Sayadaw U Tejaniya, I attended one of his retreats in Perth some years ago. And after several days, he still had not mentioned walking meditation. So one of the meditators got impatient and said, when are you going to explain walking meditation? And the Sayadaw looked at this meditator and said, walk and be aware. And that's it. And that's right, that's pretty much the complete instruction. But of course, we have to make it more complicated. So what I'll do is I'll give you the complicated version. In the walking, first of all, we always begin with the standing, which we were demonstrating this morning. So always start with the standing posture and construct that carefully. And that is already meditation. It's standing meditation. So you have a path, a walking path. At the back of the hall, there's space going across the hall, or you may walk outside. Inside the hall, you've got a controlled, fairly small area. Outside, big. So you might have a very different style of walking outside than inside. What I'll start with here is demonstrating the inside formal walking. So you start with the standing and then you step out and you start walking at normal pace. What your meditation object is movement and touch. The movement is the movement of the whole body, but especially the movement of the leg and especially of the lower leg and the foot, and the touch, the contact on the floor. So this is what you're feeling. You're feeling yourself move as you walk. So you're walking at normal pace. You come to the end of your track and then you stop, stand, turn, stand and walk. And you just keep doing this. You can start to name what you are doing. So you might name it walking. Walking. And so on. Once you get settled in and you feel like the mindfulness and the samadhi, the concentration is developing, you can start to slow down the walking. Now the reason for the slow walking is it helps develop samadhi, concentration or unification. And we'll talk more about this as we go through. If you're doing the slow walking, the first thing you might do is to divide it into two steps. So you might be naming left, right, left, right, left, right. And the awareness is coming down to the feet and the contact, becoming more detailed. After some time, you might divide each step into two. So lifting, placing. Lifting the foot off the floor, placing it back on. Lift, place. Lift, place, and so on. After a while you might settle down and you might divide it up into each step into three. Lifting, pushing, placing. Lift, push, place. Lift, push, place, and so on. This is the classical three-step Mahāsī walk. You can divide it into four. Lifting, pushing, placing, touch as the weight comes on the foot. Lift, push, place as the weight comes on the foot. Touch, or press, and so on. You come to the end of your track, stopping, standing, turning, turning, standing, walking. And you keep doing this for the meditation period. If you walk slowly, then you can develop good concentration. But do not force it. One of the common mistakes that people make in walking meditation is they try to walk too slowly too soon. If you're doing walking meditation, particularly slow walking meditation, and if you're starting to feel very tense, very tight, and you're very pleased when the walking period ends, probably what you're doing is you're walking far too slowly. You haven't got enough concentration to justify it. When you do walking meditation, do not try to walk slowly. The slowness will come naturally as you get into it. Some people, they look at experienced meditators who are walking very slowly and they think, oh, I'm supposed to walk slowly, and they turn it into this bizarre race where the winner is the slowest. And usually these are people who don't like walking meditation because it's so awful. So walk at a natural pace and allow yourself to slow down. Don't force yourself to slow down. You can also do fast walking meditation. I've got so much equipment I won't demonstrate it because I'm sure to fall over something. So basically you just walk fast, up and down, up and down, up and down. You would need a longer path. So you would not do that in here. You would do it outside. And when you walk fast, the awareness is more open. So it will be whole body. The slower you walk, the more focused in the attention becomes. So if you're doing the really slow walking, then usually the awareness would be on the details of the movement of the foot and the contact on the floor. If you're doing the fast walking, the awareness is spread out to the whole body. And you simply might name it walking or fast or whatever that seems appropriate. If you do the slow walking, be careful about developing tension in the upper body. Sometimes when you see people doing walking meditation, for example with the posture, sometimes you see them walking like this. Maybe they're looking at their feet, who knows. But what's happening is they're developing tension in the shoulders and the neck. And they might not be noticing because they're so absorbed in the walking. But what they do notice is at the end of the walking session, they're very pleased that it's over, and they decide, I don't like walking. So pay attention to posture. The body is upright, the eyes are looking down. So the eyes are important in walking. In the slow walking, the eyes are looking down and they just sweep along the floor, not grabbing at anything. Sometimes the eyes will grab at something on the floor, so they might fixate at one point. Let's say I'm walking like this. The eyes fixate on one point, I get closer, and the head goes down. And then I pass over that point and the head stays down. And I start getting tension in the upper body. So pay attention to posture in the walking. It's very important. And pay attention to see if there's any stiffness in the upper body. Often, again, you see people doing slow walking meditation, very slow, very mindful, but the upper body is very, very stiff. And this is probably because they're paying so much attention to the foot and the contact with the floor that they're not paying attention to the upper body. It's disappeared. And so all this tension develops. So when we walk naturally, it's the whole body that walks. Everything moves. And you do the same in the slow walking. So one way of doing this is I step out to the left and I lean in with the left shoulder. I step out to the right, I lean in with the right shoulder. So the whole body is walking. Another way of doing it is to walk from the abdomen, from the tan tien. Those of you who do Tai Chi or Qigong. So you focus on the movement of the tan tien in the lower abdomen. Sometimes when I'm doing it, I like to do it with the knees slightly bent. So the foot goes out and here comes the tan tien, and it's just completely smooth. The tan tien is moving through space. And it's very alert and very mindful. So there's different ways you can play around with it, and I emphasise play, experiment. If you start to feel too tight, speed up. If you're inside and you feel confined, go outside. Some people like to start fairly fast, and then throughout the period they'll slow down. And by the end of the period they're walking very slowly. Other people like to start slowly and maybe later speed up. Experiment, play with it. The essence is, this is about meditation in movement. So the detail of the movement is not so important as the awareness of the movement. And again, when you have primary and secondary object, when you realise that the attention has moved from the movement to something else, know it, name it, and come back to the primary object. When you do walking, particularly if you do it outside, you'll be particularly distracted by sight and sound, especially in a beautiful environment. There's no need to try to shut any of that out. You just let it be there, and if you realise that you're caught up, you're looking at something, you just note it. Oh, I'm seeing, looking. And that becomes your meditation object. And then come back and continue to move. So don't fight the environment, include the environment in your meditation. You see something, seeing. It's interesting perhaps. Then you know, oh, that's interesting. Interest. What does interest feel like? So you start to study your experience as it unfolds during the day. That's the walking meditation. Any questions about that? Very good. This is what I like to see. A room full of people, no questions, which means everybody completely understands. So we have the sitting meditation, we have the walking meditation, and finally we have the meditation of ordinary activity, or daily activity. Now this is what we are doing all the time when we are not doing a formal walking or or sitting meditation practice. So, going to the bathroom, going to the dining hall, having breakfast, clean-up job, going back to the dormitory, lying down, having a rest, going to the bathroom. All these are everyday activity meditation. And the job here is to keep awareness engaged. What am I doing now? What am I aware of now? I am always aware of something. But what am I aware of now? So keep paying attention. This third exercise we'll talk more about when we talk about mindfulness. It's mentioned last. Today we're saying the least about it. So the suggestion must be that it's least important. It's actually the most important. If you can get this one down, the sitting and the walking will be dead easy. If you can't get mindfulness in everyday activities down, no matter how good you are at sitting meditation and walking meditation, you'll always be operating with a huge handicap. The third one is actually the most important. So the first two, the sitting and the walking, are kind of specialised activities, specialised training to get you into shape for doing the third one, mindfulness of everyday activity. It's very important. But we'll talk more about it as we go through the retreat.